Welcome to another episode of From the Mind of Christine McConnell. So today's episode is going to cover how to make a baking apron from scratch. I will be doing a lot of sewing tutorials later on in the series, but I think I wanted to start off with something a little on the simpler side, just to kind of warm you up a little bit to how I do it. But I will be making things like cocktail dresses, evening gowns, all sorts of really fun things. So I have been sewing for probably about 10 years. I'm completely self-taught. So if you're a professional, you might laugh at some of the either techniques that I use or wordage that I use because I don't know any of the lingo. But everything looks really pretty when it's finished. I made the dress I'm wearing right now. And I think that's kind of a fun way to do things, is sort of figuring it out on your own. I don't use patterns of any kind, so you will be seeing me make something entirely from scratch. So I think the first thing we should talk about is sewing materials and where to get things and where I get things. It's kind of an expensive hobby, if I'm being totally honest, if you're just starting fresh out the gate and you don't have any of the supplies. Sewing machines don't cost a ton, but I've always purchased sort of inexpensive ones, and the tricky thing with that is if something on them breaks, sometimes to repair it is more expensive than just buying another machine. So I've kind of gone through maybe 4 or 5 machines. I'd really like Singer. I've had a lot of luck with them. I've never tried a Brothers sewing machine. Janome is another brand that I've actually had like a lot of success with and liked. As far as where I buy fabric, so I live in Southern California, and there's a place called the Garment District in downtown Los Angeles. And it's kind of far from me, but it is so amazing as far as the prices are so reasonable. Everything is right there. You can really find anything you need as far as like the accessories, and everything else is all right there. But most of the time I find myself going to Joann Fabric just because it's local, it's everywhere. But it does tend to be kind of more expensive. So if I can make the trip to, or if you can make the trip to somewhere that has sort of like wholesale prices, of the things you should splurge on, I would say a good set of shears is going to be kind of your best friend. A good pair lasts a long time. You can have them sharpened, and just don't ever cut anything other than fabric with them. That's sort of like one of the first lessons I learned. Because it's temptation. Sometimes you just want to cut something and grab a pair of scissors, and that's not a good idea. This is the best pair I have ever come across. They are so sharp, you could cut a finger off really quickly, so you want to be a little careful with them. Other sewing things you need: a seam ripper. I did a video on here where I was reupholstering a couch, and this amazing guy, his name is Gonzalo Plaza from New Hampshire, watched that and just randomly sent me this. He handmade it for me. It's a seam ripper made of like super fancy wood, and so I told him, I was like, I think I'm going to be buried with this. It's so amazing. If you don't have a ton of funds to spend on all of the random little accessories, the best thing you can do is go find a local estate sale. And because everybody used to sew back in the 50s and beyond, you can find one of these little boxes or bins. They're cases, they come in all sorts of different shapes and colors, but almost everybody has them. And it's just a box with tons of little odds and ends and all the weird little things that you need for sewing. And I pick them up a lot. So I think I have probably like 5 or 6 of these. And then at some point I finally sort of dumped out everything on the floor and sorted all of the things that I needed into different ones. So I reuse all these cases. I don't know how old this case is, but it's like the prettiest and it matches the room. So I would say that is your best bet for getting a lot of the odds and ends, and even possibly a great set of sewing shears. Getting some base measurements is pretty critical for making something like an apron. If you're making, a cocktail dress, an evening gown, you're going to want to obviously get way more in depth with your measurements. But for something like this, we're going to go with some basic measurements. And then from there, because this is actually not going to be for me, I'm making it for a contest that I have going on Patreon at the moment. So I'm going to make it in kind of a general shape that can be adjusted a little bit. So the first thing I want to figure out is my waist measurement. Mine has always been about 26 inches. So once you have that measurement, I'm going to measure from my waist. We're going to make the skirt first. So let's figure that out. So from your waist down to the lowest point that you want. And obviously if you're measuring yourself, you might just want to hold it, bend down a little, and that lets you know. I don't want this to be any longer than 25 inches. So the first part I'm going to make is the skirt of the apron. I know I don't want it to be any longer than 25 inches long, but you do want to leave yourself something called an allowance, which is you cut a little more fabric than you need just in case you need to tighten it up or bring it in. If you obviously cut yourself too little, you may end up just like ruining that piece and end up needing to make another cut, in which case you can run into trouble if you haven't purchased quite enough fabric. So this is basically kind of like an odd triangle shape. And I haven't done this on camera before as far as like really getting into the nitty-gritty of it. So this is like a first for both of us, and I hope it comes off well. I always use a pen that has disappearing ink in it to mark my fabric. And the great thing about it is you can kind of go crazy with marking up as much as you need. And then you just apply a little bit of water and the ink instantly disappears. It turns out Professor Poof is a very effective paperweight. To avoid wasting any of the fabric that I found, I shortchanged myself just a little bit on that first cut and then used a few of the extra scraps to make that first cut complete. I found a lighter pink linen that I'm going to be using to create a hem for the skirt, and I'm also going to use this to create the straps and even a few additional pieces that I'll be doing some like specialty embroidery on. I decided I wanted a repeating pattern on the main surface of the fabric, so I created a 3-inch grid, and then I'm just going to use some very thick white embroidery thread to sort of alternate in between stars and dots. I ended up deciding to make 2 aprons, and I'll explain why at the end of the video. Okay, so now that I have kind of the skirt beginning to come together, I figured I would take a moment to sort of talk about colors, textures, and sort of the way I go about doing things. So, what are you doing? Are you hanging out? Or are you going away? What are you doing? Okay. You do whatever. I'm filming something. So I don't like extremely bright, vivid colors generally, so I always look for kind of slightly muted colors, and I also find combining slightly different hues also is very, very flattering, or at least can be if done correctly. So for this, I'm doing a pretty deep pink belt, and then obviously it's going to transition to a slightly lighter, and then right here on the very border, which I haven't gotten to yet, is going to be the lightest point. And what that will hopefully look like from far away is kind of a little bit of like a blooming rose, and I just think it's going to look really elegant. Now, as far as lace goes, I kind of won the lottery about 7 years ago. I went to an estate sale, and this beautiful older woman who had passed away had this giant bag of antique Victorian lace, and I got the entire bag. I didn't actually know what it was. I just was like, oh, a bag of lace. And they were like, oh, $1. So I got it for $1, took it home, and started looking through it and realized how special it was. So I have been very, very slowly using little bits of it here and there on projects as I go along. And anything I'm going to be giving away, I always try to like add like a little bit of that, because it kind of makes the piece a little more special and sort of antique. I find that you do have to be a little bit careful with lace. If you aren't careful and you're using sort of not super expensive laces, you can very quickly end up looking like Vicky from Small Wonder. And I like looking like that sometimes, but in this particular piece, I want it to look kind of demure and elegant and keep the 80s out of it a little bit. So now I'm going to create a lining for the inside of the skirt. Initially, none of the clothes that I made were lined, and my mom was kind of always giving me guff about it, just like, she's like, you know, you should kind of complete things. I should preface this by saying she doesn't sew, but it did kind of get me thinking that maybe I should figure out how to do that. And then once I started doing it, I did realize there was a benefit to it. I don't think every single garment needs a lining, but certain ones, especially like this, where you have that specialty embroidery going on the inside, you want to keep that protected, and lining your garment is the only way to do that. I'm doing what I'd call a 2-in-1 pleat, where you measure or mark every 1 inch, then 2 inch, then 1 inch, then 2 inch, and then you just basically gather those 2-inch distances together, sew them down, and fold that flap back in the direction that you want the pleat to go. I really like working with pearlized pins for projects like this, but sadly in a hurry all I could find were these heart-shaped ones, but maybe one day I'll find some in the shape of like a tombstone or even a skull. To give the skirt just a little bit more style, I am double pleating the 6th through the 4th pleat on either side, and this will just dramatically affect the silhouette and the way that it sits on the hips. Creating a belt for a project like this is pretty straightforward. You cut the length that you need and then double the width so that when you fold it over, you can turn it inside out and then hide the seam on the back side of the belt. I do not know what it is about cats and sewing materials, but based on all of their behavior, it seems like the manufacturers of fabrics are lacing their product with crack cocaine. Now that the belt is done, it's time to move on to the straps. I want the pinafore section on this apron to have a really three-dimensional feel, which will affect the way that I cut out this next part. So I'm cutting these straps with some hills and valleys. That way when I attach it to the center bodice piece, it'll create a really lovely silhouette. The way I'm creating the shape for the center bodice panel is I'm sketching out sort of a rough draft shape, cutting that out and then cutting it in half. Then I will use the best half, flip it over twice to trace over so it's identical on both sides, and then basically just use that as my base template. The pattern I designed for the skirt with a 3-inch grid doesn't really work for the size of the center panel, so I'm just kind of eyeballing some measurements to get the placement just right. I've come across a really great way to create your own embroidery pattern by sketching out your initial draft in disappearing ink. I like this method because I rarely get things perfect the first time, and if you do mess anything up here, you can just take a brush with some water and sort of go over those sections, wait till it dries, and then start over. Once you're happy with the design, you can mix some fabric paint and then very, very delicately trace over the outlines that you've drawn. That way, when you rinse away all of the disappearing ink, all you're left with is a perfect outline, which is so easy to stitch onto. So this is starting to really come together, and I have finally gotten to the part that I love the most, which is where I just get to lay in bed and fiddle around with the embroidery part of this, just because I like that part. It's kind of like a mindless, fun thing to do. So I've got a ton of thread here. I've got an old movie playing. I've got cats in the room. And I have these embroidery hoops. You can pick these up at any hobby store. It's just basically 2 rounds of wood. You put the fabric in between them, and screw that together. And essentially what it does is it just pulls the fabric taut so you can easily get in and out of there without having the fabric like bundling up on you or pinching in any way. So I don't know, it's probably about 4 o'clock right now, and I'm just going to keep doing this until, I don't know, 4 o'clock in the morning, just until I get tired. But I think this is going to be great. And like I said, this is kind of the really fun, relaxing part where you get to sort of unwind while you do this. I love recycling the underwires of old bras that I don't wear anymore. And so what I'm going to do here is remove an old underwire, heat it up over the stove, and mold it into a shape that I can use as sort of, I guess you'd call it like a boning, to apply on the top of the bodice for the pinafore section. I'm coating the tips of these wires in Plasti-Dip so that when I put it in the little cloth sleeve that I've made for it, it'll stop it from potentially sort of poking through, which can happen sometimes and is horribly uncomfortable when it starts stabbing you. I'm kind of going a little bit overkill by adding all of this boning to something like an apron, but I want this to be like a really special piece that has a lot of structure and holds a really incredible shape. After a while, it really starts to hurt your fingers, but I personally love the experience of hand sewing large pieces together. I feel like you get a really seamless look and everything ends up looking kind of more homemade and special. So they are all finished. I'm so happy with how they came out. I had mentioned that I was making 2, and there's a reason for that. This is going to a girl named Rachel. She won like a drawing or a contest that I was having on Patreon to give it the worst name possible. And her submission was Jeffrey Dahmer's Cooking Up Christmas, which is horrible. So I just basically asked people to come up with the worst name, and I think that's the worst. And so she gets this apron, and it will be on its way to Scotland next week. And it also will be packed in this pretty little box that I made. The second one is, I think I've made it super clear to people that I'm very close with my mom, and she's kind of my very best friend. And Mandy, who this is for, lost her mom last Halloween, and the story came to me, and it just, it reminded me of the relationship I have with my mom. And the reason I'm sharing it with you is that I know everyone doesn't have necessarily perfect parents, but I hope everyone cherishes them and loves them. And I don't know, I just felt like something told me to make this for her. So I did. I also handcrafted these boxes totally from scratch. And on Patreon, I'll be showing a video, an exclusive video for patrons of how I made that box. And if you're in the $7 and up tier, I will be providing a pattern for the apron and a pattern for the box. So be sure to tune in for that. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. It was very fun. I was nervous about like a sewing project from beginning to end, and I feel like it worked out. So tune in next month, and I've got really fun things coming your way. See you soon.